every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a distinct sound to absolute isolation. It is the sound of a room where a person believes they are entirely alone, surrounded by the porcelain and tile of a hotel bathroom, shielded from the watchful eyes of the world. In this private sanctuary, the masks we wear for society are allowed to slip. The posture relaxes. The internal monologue, usually trapped behind the teeth, occasionally leaks out into the sterile air. Most of us whisper our anxieties, our mundane reminders, or our petty grievances to the mirror. But when the man in the mirror has spent a lifetime stepping over the bodies of those closest to him, the whispers take on a different, terrifying shape. What happens when a man who has successfully purchased his own reality for 7 decades forgets that the microphone clipped to his shirt is still transmitting? Today, we dissect the anatomy of privilege and a hot mic. We are going to examine the case of Robert Durst, a prince of New York real estate, and explore how extreme wealth, high-priced defense teams, and a staggering lack of empathy acted as an impenetrable shield for decades. We will trace the bloodline of this privilege from the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan to the murky waters of Galveston Bay, culminating in the sheer arrogance of an accidental confession that finally brought down a dynasty's darkest secret. To understand the protective shell that encased Robert Durst, we must first understand the empire that built it. The Durst organization is not merely a successful company, it is a foundational pillar of the New York City skyline. Founded by Joseph Durst in 1915, the company grew into a multi-billion-dollar real estate behemoth. By the time Robert was born in 1943, the eldest son of Seymour and Bernice Durst, he was heir to a kingdom of concrete, steel, and unimaginable influence. In this world, problems were not solved. They were managed. Inconveniences were erased with a checkbook. It was an environment that inherently taught its scions that the rules governing ordinary people simply did not apply to them. But beneath the veneer of ultimate success lay a foundation cracked by profound trauma. In the dead of night in 1950, when Robert was just 7 years old, tragedy struck the Durst home in Scarsdale, New York. His mother, Bernice, fell from the roof of their estate to her death. Robert would later claim, most notably during the filming of the documentary The Jinx, that his father walked him to a window and forced him to watch his mother standing on the roof just moments before she died. Whether this is a factual memory or a self-serving narrative crafted by a damaged mind remains heavily disputed by his own family. His brother Douglas has vehemently denied that Robert was ever forced to witness such a thing. Regardless of the exact sequence of events, the violent, sudden loss of his mother left an indelible psychological scar. It introduced a chilling detachment into Robert's life, a detachment that would eventually metastasize into something far more dangerous. As Robert grew into adulthood, he was expected to take the reins of the family empire, but his behavior was increasingly erratic. He was known for talking to himself, for sudden outbursts of rage, and for an unsettling, flat affect that made colleagues and family members deeply uncomfortable. Despite his eccentricities, his wealth granted him access to circles of society that insulated him from consequence. It was within this bubble of privilege that he met Kathleen McCormick in the early 1970s. Kathy was a beautiful, vibrant dental hygienist from a working-class family on Long Island. To Robert, she was a breath of fresh air, disconnected from the suffocating expectations of the Durst legacy. To Kathy, Robert was charming, worldly, and offered a life of comfort and adventure she had never known. They married in 1973, on Robert's 30th birthday. The fairy tale quickly soured. The power dynamic in their marriage was entirely lopsided, rooted in financial control and Robert's growing paranoia. As Kathy sought her own independence, enrolling in medical school and building a life outside of Robert's shadow, his behavior turned controlling and physically abusive. Friends and family members recalled seeing Kathy with unexplained bruises. She spoke of her fear of her husband, confiding in friends that if anything ever happened to her, they should look at Robert. The anatomy of their relationship had become a classic textbook case of coercive control, exacerbated by a husband who knew that his family's wealth could legally obscure almost any transgression. The breaking point arrived in the winter of 1982. On the weekend of January 31, 1982, Kathy attended a dinner party at a friend's home in Connecticut. She received an angry phone call from Robert, demanding she return to their stone cottage in South Salem, New York. She left the party visibly upset, telling her host that she was afraid of what Robert might do. That was the last time Kathy Durst was ever seen by her friends or family. According to Robert's timeline, she returned to the South Salem cottage. They had an argument, and he then drove her to the nearby train station so she could travel back to their Manhattan penthouse for medical school the next day. He claimed he later spoke to her on a payphone to confirm she had arrived at their city apartment, and then he went to have a drink with a neighbor. This narrative, constructed entirely by Robert, became the foundational lie of a decades-long cover-up. The initial investigation into Kathy's disappearance perfectly illustrates the paralyzing effect of extreme wealth on the justice system. When Robert finally reported her missing days later, he was not immediately treated as a primary suspect, as would be standard procedure in almost any other domestic disappearance. The New York Police Department was dealing with a member of a family that essentially owned a significant portion of the city. Detectives allowed Robert to dictate the pace of his interviews. They failed to immediately secure and thoroughly search the South Salem cottage, the most likely primary crime scene. They accepted Robert's timeline with alarming credulity. Crucially, the investigation was derailed by a series of highly convenient, yet deeply suspicious, events. A woman claiming to be Kathy called the dean of her medical school on February 1st to say she was sick and would not be attending classes. Decades later, it would become painfully clear that this call was likely made by an accomplice to establish that Kathy was alive and in Manhattan the day after she vanished. Furthermore, an elevator operator at the Durst's Manhattan apartment building claimed to have seen Kathy on the night she disappeared. This sighting, heavily influenced by the media circus and the pressure of the Durst name, muddied the waters and directed police resources away from the South Salem cottage. The anatomy of this early investigation is a master class in how a powerful suspect can leverage their status to create reasonable doubt before a formal inquiry even truly begins. Without a body, without a secured crime scene, and with a suspect shielded by high-powered attorneys and a multi-billion-dollar family name, the investigation into Kathy's disappearance eventually went cold. Robert Durst walked away, leaving Kathy's family in an agonizing purgatory of unanswered questions. He returned to the Durst organization, but his erratic behavior only worsened. He was known to keep a plumber's wrench on his desk and urinate in wastebaskets during executive meetings. Eventually, the family patriarch, Seymour Durst, made the unprecedented decision to bypass Robert, the eldest son, and name his younger brother Douglas as the successor to the company. This profound rejection severed Robert's formal ties to the family business. Though he was bought out of his share of the family trust for a reported $65 million, he was now a man with limitless financial resources, profound grievances, and a terrifying secret. For nearly 2 decades, Robert Durst drifted. He traveled the world, lived in multiple homes, and maintained a relatively low profile. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the late 1990s, the political winds in New York shifted. Jeanine Pirro, the ambitious district attorney of Westchester County, decided to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Kathy Durst. Pirro's investigators began re-interviewing old witnesses and looking at the case with fresh eyes, untainted by the deference shown by detectives in 1982. As the news of the reopened investigation hit the press, a wave of panic must have washed over Robert. The shield was beginning to crack, and he knew exactly where the vulnerability lay. That vulnerability was a woman named Susan Berman. Susan was an extraordinary character in her own right. She was the daughter of David Berman, a notorious mobster who had operated in Las Vegas alongside Bugsy Siegel. Susan grew up in a world of privilege and shadow, possessing a fierce intelligence and a complex moral compass shaped by her father's underworld ties. She had met Robert at UCLA in the 1960s, and they formed a deep, enduring bond. When Kathy vanished in 1982, Susan had acted as Robert's unofficial spokesperson, fielding calls from the press and fiercely defending her friend. Many investigators and journalists had long suspected that Susan knew exactly what happened to Kathy. Some theorized that she was the woman who made the phone call to the medical school on February 1st, pretending to be Kathy. In the fall of 2000, as Westchester investigators prepared to travel to Los Angeles to interview Susan Berman, Robert Durst made a move. On December 24, 2000, Susan was found dead in her Beverly Hills home. She had been shot once in the back of the head, execution style. There was no forced entry, nothing was stolen, and her beloved dogs were left unharmed. It was an intimate murder, committed by someone she trusted enough to turn her back on. The execution of Susan Berman was a preemptive strike, a desperate attempt to sever the only remaining link to the truth of what happened in South Salem. The Beverly Hills Police Department arrived at a baffling scene, but the most critical piece of evidence had arrived in the mail a few days prior. The police department received an envelope containing a single sheet of paper. On the paper was Susan Berman's address, and the word cadaver. The envelope was addressed in distinct block capital letters. Crucially, the city of Beverly Hills was misspelled as Beverly. This anonymous note, directing police to the body, was a profound psychological tell. It demonstrated a bizarre compulsion, a need to control the discovery of the crime, perhaps out of a twisted sense of obligation to ensure his friend's body was found before it decomposed. It was a mistake, an artifact of arrogance that would sleep in an evidence locker for more than a decade. Following Susan's murder, Robert Durst knew the authorities were closing in. He did not behave like an innocent man mourning his closest friend. He ran. He liquidated assets, gathered hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, and disappeared. He resurfaced in the most unlikely of places, a rundown $300 a month boarding house in Galveston, Texas. To evade detection, the heir to the Durst fortune adopted a bizarre and elaborate disguise. He rented the apartment under the name Dorothy Sinner, an old high school acquaintance. He wore a wig, spoke in a hushed, breathy voice, and posed as a mute woman. This was not the behavior of a rational man. It was the behavior of a fugitive, possessing the resources to fund any fantasy, retreating into a twisted performance art to hide from the law. His neighbor across the hall, in Galveston, was a man named Morris Black. Black was a difficult, cantankerous man, known for his abrasive personality, Sometime in late September 2001, the paths of the fugitive billionaire and the angry loner collided in a gruesome and catastrophic manner. On September 30, 2001, a teenage boy fishing in Galveston Bay discovered a torso floating in the water. Over the next few days, police recovered garbage bags containing severed arms and legs. The head was missing and would never be found. Inside one of the garbage bags, amidst the horrifying remains, investigators found a crucial piece of physical evidence: a torn piece of newspaper with a delivery address, and a receipt from a local hardware store for a drop cloth, garbage bags, and a bow saw. The anatomy of this investigation moved with lightning speed compared to 1982. The address on the newspaper led police directly to the boarding house and to the apartment of the strange, mute woman named Dorothy Sinner. When they entered the apartment, they found blood spatter on the walls and floors. Despite a frantic attempt to clean the scene, shortly after, Robert Durst, having shed his disguise, returned to the apartment and was arrested. When police searched his car, they found the tools of dismemberment, a loaded handgun, and the terrifying reality of who they had in custody. The Texas authorities realized they had arrested the heir to a New York real estate empire for the grisly murder and dismemberment of a neighbor. Bail was set at $300,000, a staggering sum for an ordinary citizen, but mere pocket change for Robert Durst. He arranged for a wire transfer, walked out of the Galveston jail, and vanished again. He was officially a fugitive, the subject of a nationwide manhunt. For 6 weeks, the billionaire killer was a ghost. His capture, when it finally occurred, was an absurd anticlimax that perfectly encapsulated his fractured psyche. On November 30, 2001, in a Wegmans supermarket in Bath, Pennsylvania, Robert Durst was caught shoplifting a chicken salad sandwich, a Band-Aid, and a newspaper. When police searched him, they found he had over $500 in cash in his pocket and over $37,000 in the trunk of his rental car, along with 2 handguns and marijuana. He could have bought the entire supermarket, yet he chose to steal a sandwich. This act of petty theft, born of an inexplicable psychological compulsion, ended his run. Durst was extradited back to Texas to face trial for the murder of Morris Black. It was here that the true power of his privilege was put on full display. Durst hired a legendary defense team, led by the brilliant and theatrical Texas attorney Dick DeGuerin. The legal strategy they devised was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation and audacity. They knew they could not deny that Durst had dismembered the body. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Instead, they made a calculated decision to separate the act of the killing from the act of the dismemberment. The defense presented a narrative of self-defense. They argued that Morris Black had illegally entered Durst's apartment, discovered his true identity, and threatened him with Durst's own target pistol. In the ensuing struggle for the gun, they claimed it discharged accidentally, shooting Black in the face. The defense then painted a picture of a man driven mad by fear and undiagnosed psychological conditions, exacerbated by the trauma of his mother's suicide and the relentless pursuit by Jeanine Pirro. They argued that in a state of dissociative panic, Durst did not call the police, fearing no one would believe a fugitive billionaire. Instead, he made the grotesque, albeit legally separate, decision to cut up the body to move it out of the apartment. During the trial, Durst himself took the stand. He was coached to perfection, appearing small, frail, and remarkably calm. He admitted to the horrifying details of the dismemberment with a chillingly flat affect, describing the use of the bow saw and the paring knife as if reciting a grocery list. The defense effectively put the victim, Morris Black, on trial, painting him as aggressive and dangerous. The prosecution, perhaps overconfident in the gruesome nature of the evidence, struggled to overcome the defense's meticulously crafted narrative of a terrified, mentally fragile man defending his own life. Against all odds, the strategy worked. The jury, seemingly convinced by the self-defense argument regarding the actual shooting, and instructed by the judge to evaluate the murder charge separately from the dismemberment, returned a verdict of not guilty. The acquittal of Robert Durst for the murder of Morris Black sent shockwaves across the country. It was viewed by many as a grotesque miscarriage of justice, a stark demonstration of how an elite legal defense team could construct a multi-million-dollar alternate reality in a courtroom. Durst later pleaded guilty to bail jumping and evidence tampering related to the dismemberment, serving a minimal sentence. Once again, the wealth had acted as an impenetrable shield. He had literally gotten away with cutting a man into pieces. Following his release from prison in Texas, Durst could have disappeared into obscurity, living out his days in quiet luxury. But the anatomy of privilege often breeds a specific type of narcissism, an arrogant belief in one's own invincibility. In 2010, a filmmaker named Andrew Jarecki released a movie called All Good Things, a lightly fictionalized account of Robert and Kathy Durst's marriage and her disappearance, starring Ryan Gosling. The film presented a deeply unflattering, though largely accurate portrait of a man driven to murder by a cold, controlling nature. Against the advice of his lawyers, his family, and every instinct of self-preservation, Robert Durst contacted Andrew Jarecki. He liked the film. He felt it portrayed him as a complex figure rather than a monster, and he wanted to sit down for a series of interviews. This decision marked the beginning of the end. Durst believed he was smarter than the filmmakers, smarter than the police, smarter than the public. He believed he could spin his own narrative on camera and finally control the story of his life. Over several years, Jarecki and his team conducted extensive on-camera interviews with Durst. They allowed him to speak, to lie, and to weave his complex web of half-truths. But simultaneously, the documentary team was conducting their own relentless investigation. They unearthed documents, tracked down long-lost witnesses, and meticulously fact-checked every statement Durst made. The project evolved into the groundbreaking documentary series, The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. The defining breakthrough of The Jinx, and the hinge upon which the entire case would finally turn, was not a confession, but a piece of paper. Sarah Kaufman, the stepson of Susan Berman, was going through her belongings and found a letter Robert Durst had written to Susan in 1999. The letter was addressed in distinct block capital letters. The city was Beverly Hills, and it was misspelled exactly as it was on the cadaver note. Beverly. Kaufman handed this letter over to the filmmakers. Jarecki brought in forensic document examiners, who concluded that the handwriting on the 1999 letter and the 2000 cadaver note were an absolute match. The shield had finally cracked, not by the force of law enforcement, but by the relentless inquiry of journalists armed with a single devastating piece of comparative evidence. In the final interview for The Jinx, Jarecki confronted Durst with the two letters. He placed them side by side on the table. The camera captured the profound physical reaction of a man realizing he has been caught in a trap of his own making. Durst blinked rapidly, his jaw clenched, and he began to burp nervously, a physical tic he exhibited under extreme stress. He denied writing the cadaver note, but admitted the handwriting was indistinguishable. The interview ended, and the cameras stopped rolling, but the microphone clipped to Durst's shirt was still live. Durst stood up, asked for a restroom, and walked into a small hotel bathroom. He closed the door, believing he was finally alone, free from the scrutiny of the interrogator. The audio recorder continued to capture his private whispered monologue. In that isolated space, the armor of privilege completely disintegrated. The whispers were disjointed, terrified, and damning. He muttered to himself, agonizing over his performance. He whispered about the letters, acknowledging the impossibility of his own lies. And then, in a moment of pure, unguarded, horrifying clarity, he delivered the lines that would become the epitaph of his entire existence. "There it is. You're caught. What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." The hot mic had captured what 3 decades of police investigations, grand juries, and high-profile trials had failed to secure: an admission of guilt. It was the ultimate unforced error, born of a lifetime of never having to worry about the consequences of his actions. He had become so accustomed to his own invulnerability that he forgot the basic mechanics of the technology attached to his own chest. The airing of the jinx was a cultural phenomenon, but the real-world consequences were already in motion. Law enforcement, coordinating with the filmmakers, had been quietly building a case based on the new evidence uncovered during the documentary's production. On March 14, 2015, the day before the final episode of The Jinx aired, Robert Durst was arrested in a hotel lobby in New Orleans, Louisiana. Once again, he was preparing to run. In his hotel room, FBI agents found a loaded revolver, massive amounts of cash, marijuana, a fake Texas ID, and a hyper-realistic latex mask that slipped entirely over his head and neck. He had a map of Cuba, a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. He was a wealthy, desperate old man, cornered by his own hubris. Durst was eventually extradited to Los Angeles to face trial for the murder of Susan Berman. This trial, delayed by his failing health and the global pandemic, was vastly different from the spectacle in Texas. The prosecution, led by the meticulous Deputy District Attorney John Lewin, was unyielding. Lewin did not allow Durst to dictate the narrative. He utilized the audio from the hot mic, the handwriting analysis of the cadaver note, and a devastating new witness. Nick Chavin, an advertising executive and a mutual friend of both Durst and Berman, testified that after a dinner in New York, Durst had plainly confessed to him. Chavin recalled Durst saying about Susan, "I had to. It was her or me. I had no choice." This testimony explicitly linked the murder of Susan Berman to the cover-up of Kathy Durst's death, establishing the motive that prosecutors had sought for nearly 40 years. Despite a defense strategy that again tried to minimize his culpability, arguing the hot mic audio was heavily edited and the handwriting evidence was flawed, the sheer weight of his accumulated lies finally crushed him. On September 17, 2021, a Los Angeles jury found Robert Durst guilty of the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. The verdict officially shattered the myth of his invincibility. Shortly after, a New York grand jury finally indicted him for the murder of Kathy Durst, moving to hold him accountable for the crime that started it all. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Robert Durst did not live long in captivity. He died in a state prison hospital facility in January 2022 at the age of 78. His death brought a quiet, bureaucratic end to a loud and violent life. He died a convicted murderer, stripped of the veneer of respectability that his family name had long provided. The legacy of his wealth was ultimately unable to save him from the forensic reality of his own actions and the relentless persistence of those who refused to let his victims be forgotten. The anatomy of this case is not simply about forensic science or police procedure. It is a profound study of power, immunity, and the dangerous illusion of untouchability. For over 30 years, Robert Durst lived inside a fortress built by generational wealth and guarded by elite legal mercenaries. He manipulated the justice system, destroyed the lives of those who loved him, and carved a bloody path across the country, confident that his checkbook could always buy his freedom. But fortresses built on lies are inherently fragile. The walls did not fall because of a brilliant police raid or a sudden attack of conscience. They fell because a man who believed he was a god among men retreated to a bathroom, closed the door, and spoke the truth to a microphone he had forgotten was there. The silence that protected Robert Durst for a lifetime was finally broken, not by the law, but by his own fatal whisper. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.